Hi, everyone. Hope you had a good week, and welcome to episode 60 of Sword of the Spirit Sermonator. So as you'll recall, and we're going to take our time with this, probably going to be the next several weeks, we're going to stay in Daniel. And as a matter of fact, I think I said that my intent wasn't to go into the stuff that we had talked about many months ago. But I'm being led more and more to take it through the entire book of Daniel and restate the 70 weeks issue, and the idea of what's going on in the world today, end times. So with that being said, we're going to continue on and we'll go through the entire book of Daniel, and we'll repeat much of the information that we gave in our podcast, probably within the first 5 or 6 weeks, or episodes rather, when we started. It was called 70 Weeks Are Determined. So you can listen on that and brush up on that before we get to it. But tonight we're going to take just a quick run through, a couple of brief comments on what we've seen so far. What we've seen so far is we have seen that Daniel and his brothers have found favor in Nebuchadnezzar's court, and that there was the normal courtly intrigue that went on to cause them to not be seen in such a great light. And then the king had the vision and the dream, and could not understand it. None of his soothsayers, we can call them, or basically charlatans and moon stargazers, they couldn't come up with an answer. And it was a very tough thing for them in the end. But Daniel came in, he said, let me take care of this. Let me give you the answer of what's going on. And he did. And he was honest with the king, and he told him exactly what was happening. And now we come to a place now where Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 decides to erect an image of gold that was 80 cubits, so that would be 90 feet tall. I think we went through that, and we looked at that last week. And they kind of trick him. The princes and the governors and the captains kind of trick him into setting up an edict, one that he could not walk away from. In Babylonian law, if the king made an edict and put his seal to it, they wore seal rings and dipped in wax, and it was a seal of royalty, their kingly seal. Once he did that, he couldn't undo it, even though he was the king. So they knew that, and it was very specific that when the musical instruments begin to play, that everybody needs to fall down and worship in that same hour in the midst of the burning, otherwise you're getting thrown in a fire. You had to bow down and worship. Now, isn't it interesting what a precursor this is to what happens in Revelation? It's the same thing. Those who get the mark of the beast, okay, and who worship its image, we know what happens to them, okay? But it's a counterfeit. It's a counterfeit because it's kind of funny. And here it says, if you don't worship the beast, you'll get thrown in the fire. In Revelation, it says, if you do worship the beast, you're going to get thrown in the fire. So it's basically like everything else, many things in Scripture, especially when there's skullduggery going on. And there was a lot of it going on, as we've seen in very manipulative ways that the populace did things and the royalty did things. So a counterfeit, always seems to come first, all right? And especially in a spiritual sense. In fact, if you had to ask me my thoughts, somebody did once about prayer tongues and speaking in tongues and praying in tongues. It's a private language between you and God. Demonic forces cannot understand that language. Sometimes they hear what we pray out loud, and they try to, preempt God's timing and beat him to the punch and see if they can fool us. But remember, if we're in God's hands, he says, nothing can separate you from that. But people have been fooled by counterfeits, okay? And I think I've given this example once before, but treasury agents are taught, about counterfeit money. And you say, well, gee, how could they possibly learn that? There's probably thousands, if not millions, of techniques and, ways to counterfeit money. But the reality is they don't study the counterfeits. They study the real thing, and they know it so well, that they could close their eyes and discern a discrepancy and pick out a counterfeit. So the point is to know it so well, to know this word so well, such that we don't get fooled by the counterfeit. Because remember, 2 Thessalonians 2:4, there will be a great falling away. And then the man of sin will be revealed. I had a discussion with a very good friend of mine, Rabbi, the other day about that very thing, the falling away. And he goes, well, who do you think's going to fall away? I said, well, who do you think's going to fall away? I said, it ain't you guys. It's not the Muslims, not the Hindus, it's not the Taoists, it's not the this, not the atheists. It's the people that call themselves believing, okay? Many of them very good, strong Christian people, good believers, good people, all right? But, and they're sincere. Just as the teachers were who taught these end times teachings, but they were also sincerely wrong. And not by design, it's just that they got some things well out of focus, which we have shown in Scripture are very different. But you see, when people put all their faith in a teaching that is not substantiated in Scripture, it's kind of like when its spiritual rug is going to get pulled out from underneath them, and it says there'll be a great falling away. And that's tragic. So that's why we're here, to make sure that we know, because it's in here, in this word, in this book, right here. It's all there. All right? So now we see that the king's mandate, which was finagled, is a crisis now, because he's got to make good on his mandate. So, we don't want to mistake Daniel and his friends or any kind of rabble-rousers or nuisances in it. These were highly respected people in the court, as you can see, because we talked about their positions that were given to them. But these guys had such a strong faith, and that kind of resolution, all right, it just doesn't come as a whim or by chance. It doesn't happen overnight. It says, work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Move through it. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. He'll lift you up. But we're all going to face crises. And some would say that a crisis will develop character in a person. I don't buy it. Crisis or crises don't develop character. They reveal it. They reveal it. Remember the old saying, you're going to talk the talk, walk the walk. It applies. So, all of these things, Daniel, the rest of them were put to the test. The dream was of the kingdoms that we spoke about, okay? And we now know that Daniel and his guys, they're in the firing line because of this basically presidential mandate, executive order by Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And he's got to follow through. He's got to follow through. But Daniel tells him all about what's going on. He says, I wish this wasn't for you, but, there's going to be another kingdom. It's inferior to yours. It'll arise after you, and yet a third kingdom, and there shall be yet a fourth kingdom. When we look at verses 39 and 40 of chapter 2, we see that, okay? And we know that as we go on in that chapter, he says in verses 44 and 45, that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all the kingdoms, the ones from the vision, and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as the king saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. So a lot of folks would tend to say that the only areas in Daniel that speak of a vision in the future are near the end, but it's not true. We've seen it already, and we see the establishment of kingdoms. So it's a progressive look toward the future, with the ultimate statement being made here that there's going to be an eternal kingdom that nobody's going to touch, and a stone will be pulled from a rock, a mountain, okay? God's holy hill. Yeshua was called a stumbling stone, all right? We are told to throw ourselves upon the rock. It be broken, to be built up. So God basically made known to the king through Daniel what things were going to be like, and how his kingdom was going to be overrun, and what was going to happen, and every bit of it did. But no need to panic there, none at all. So that said, we did a good walk through Daniel 1 and 2. And we talked a little bit about also tolerance and what we see in the world today. Essentially, these Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, they knew how to run a kingdom, and they got some great guys, including the people from their captive, like Daniel and his brothers, to come in and help and move that thing, and they arose. So he was not afraid to have some diversity, even though they were conquered people, and entrust them with things of the kingdom, the physical kingdom. But as the tendency is with a lot of bosses, CEOs, politicians, people in positions of power, power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely corrupts. So, you start to feel like you're a little bit bigger than the problem. And I can tell you that as we're going to see with Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, his son or grandson, and I can tell you from experience, from what I've seen, that kingdoms, nations, churches, ministers, whatever, their fall is always due to pride. If you ask me, they talk about 7 deadly sins. Pride is one, greed is another. I think those two pretty much cover it all. But that's for another discussion. All right, so in chapter 3, Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar erects this image, and all of a sudden, Daniel's friends refuse to bow down. So these rats go and they say, and whoso falls not down and worships, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fire. Right, King-O? Right, King Nebi? Right? Yes. Well, there are certain Jews, now all of a sudden they're Jews. They're not people of the kingdom. You can see the jealousy right there. whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee, and they serve not thy gods, nor do they worship the golden image with that which you had set up. Okay? They're not buying it. Well, that's the world today. Same thing. So Daniel's friends, his brothers, really, they trust in God. They trust in God. Nebuchadnezzar went into a rage in verse 13 of Daniel 3. And he commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then they brought him before the king. And he said, is it true, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, do you not serve my gods nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, mind you, this is a guy who just revered their brother Daniel for talking to his God, the God, acknowledged to give this guy an understanding of his dream, which between you and me, I don't think he liked it too much anyway. But he bought it, okay? So, now, he gives him one more chance. He says, if you be ready, when you hear the instruments, the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, all that, psaltery, the dulcimer, all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I've made, well, it'll be good with you. But if you don't, you're going to be cast that same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Well, not a good choice, King. Not a good choice. So, you want to know who tough guys are? We talked about the Messiah himself, the toughest that ever, and St. Peter. I like that St. Peter, the apostle. Tough guy. A lot of tough guys. But long before the Messiah, these people had the relationship with the Father. And it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we're not going to be even careful. We're not even going to carefully answer you in this matter. All right? If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you now that we're never going to serve your gods, and we're never going to worship your golden image that you set up. Forget about it. They were not afraid. Those are tough guys. So the king, he loses his mind at this point. He goes into a rage, such that his face changed, and he commanded them to heat the furnace up 7 times hotter. In fact, it was so hot that the men that were commanded to do that and cast them in a fire, they wound up getting burnt and dead. It says, listen, and he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats. They were basically tied up and cast into the midst of the fire. And because the king's commandment was urgent and the fire exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men and took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the 3 men fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Boo. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonied, it says, astonished. He might have been astonied. He rose up in haste. He spoke and he said to his counselors, didn't we just throw 3 guys into the fire? They said, yes, king, that's true, O king. Well, I see 4 walking around loose in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the form of the 4th one is like the Son of God. Who was the Son of God? They didn't know Son of God. There was no Son of God or Messiah at that point. There was no incarnation at that point. Maybe an archangel. Maybe it was. The Bible's silent on who it was. That's all it says. Like the Son of God. What a statement. So, that's kind of freaky. The king looks at that and comes to the point. He comes near to the mouth of the burning, fiery furnace in verse 26. And he speaks out and he says, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, You servants of the Most High God, come forth, come hither, get out of there. And they came forth and out of the midst of the fire. And the princes and the governors and the captains and the king's counselors all were gathered together, saw these men come out of the fire, not even a hair singed on them, not even their garments, didn't even smell of a fire. Then the king spoke, as Nebuchadnezzar spoke, and he said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have sent his angel, one like the Son of God, sent his angel, his messenger, and delivered his servants that trusted in him. And they have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Listen now, another decree coming. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Isn't that interesting? Promoted means elevated them in status, not just a promotion on a job, not more shekels, but promoted them in the social status in the court. Now, some things, as you know, how we do, we look at names, we try to understand what's going on. And we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Babylonian names given to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as it says in chapter 1, Daniel's brothers. So let's just take a look at those names, because there's something really intense going on here, way below the surface level, that we really need to understand. Okay? So, by the way, the word promote, when he says he promoted these guys, in the Strong's Hebrew, number 6329, it basically means he brought them out to go forth and to advance in status and in honor, okay? And that was a big deal, because it basically turned the kingdom upside down and then right side back up again. And they went through the fire, persecution. God says it will go through fires too, but nothing will take us out of his hand. That's a matter of our faith. Now let's look at these names. So, in Hebrew, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah mean the following. All right? Mean the following. God is gracious, and who is like unto God? God has helped us. That's what those three original Hebrew names mean. God is gracious. Who is like unto God? God has helped us. Now, we'll look at what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego mean in the Hebrew. And you'll be very interested to know what's going on here. From the bottom up, a servant of Nebu, the god of the earth, who is like Aku, who has command, Aku of the moon god. Well, that doesn't sound a whole lot like anything. God is gracious. We are by the light. The moon god, Aku, is the basis, because I'm going to tell you that the seeds of the religious beast in the Middle East were set back here in those three names. The conflict, the real God saved them. Their names reflect the one true God. But the names that were given to them, that were changed, they were assimilated. Remember, everybody wanted to assimilate the Jews. Oh, throughout history, they had to assimilate into cultures and countries and places because they had no home. That was the tribulation, being pressed and squeezed and treated poorly. By the way, anti-Semitism is on the rise. They're fleeing. Jews are fleeing Germany in droves, and they're also fleeing the United States in droves to go to Israel. But when we look at this here, Nebu, God of the earth, as opposed to the God, our God, all right, who is the divine light. Okay? And he says, well, who is Aku? Well, Aku actually means evil. But Aku is called here commanding the command of the moon god. So it says a servant of Nabu, the god of the earth, who is like Aku, who commands the moon god. Well, do you know who the moon god is? I'm just going to be blunt. It's Allah. If you research Allah, all right, here's the moon god. Plain and simple. These were the Babylonian equivalent names. So we have the god of the earth and the moon god, who became, Allah, Islam, and Aku are all wrapped up in here. And it's earthly, and the worship is of things created, the moon, the earth, gods with little g. He changed their names to mean that, which is an interesting dynamic, because later on we'll see how the king actually never really buys into the one God as Jehovah. He knows what these guys' names mean in Babylonian, and you'll see as we go through in chapter 4 and some more proclamations what's really going on here. So, yes, we have the moon god, okay? And by the way, these are in all the languages, the Akkadian, the Assyrian, all of it, all right? The god of the earth, all right? Who is like Nebu, who is subordinate to Aku, who is the moon god that we know as Allah. Even then, this was a long time before any of this ever happened. Not only centuries, but millennia. Very important, because when you put the picture together, you begin to see really what's going on. And we begin to see also that the line was drawn in the sand, that those guys basically told that king, not happening. I don't care what you do to us. We don't care if God saves us or not. It's his purposes that we're here. All were created for him, by him, and for his pleasure. All right? No matter what happens, we ain't bowing to your God, and we're not going to worship your stupid image. And that's basically what they said, and that's what it was. So, we all have their idols in life, and we can see, in our lives that there are many idols, there are many images, there are many things, not just those things that were put up there in ancient civilizations, right? And we have to get used to the fact that we have to recognize not to bow down to these idols, artificial, man-made, created ones, whatever, nature, all this other stuff. When we do, that's idolatry. And that's not a problem just in ancient civilizations. It's a problem in all human societies because it's a problem of a human heart. Romans, the first chapter, speaks to everyone when it says that. It says, although they knew God deep down, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men. They worshiped and they served the creatures rather than the Creator. Romans 1, verses 21 through 23 and 25. See you in a minute. We're going to take a break.